Okay, so we have some of us here, and as Susan said, I'm Mark MacCarthy, and thanks to Susan for having me and for this wonderful panel. So the metaverse, yeah. You just heard that the metaverse is sort of the next phase of the internet, where a 3D immersive interface replaces the familiar 2D screen. It's according to City Research, it's going to be a big deal. Their latest estimate is that it could amount to a $13 trillion economy. So this is not a trivial thing. And of course, it raises a host of legal, law, and jurisdiction questions. And with me to discuss these issues is a distinguished panel. I have here to my right, Bertrand de la Chapelle. And I think somewhere else, we have Tom Campbell, Eugene, Volokh, and Rob Currie. Their bios are somewhere in your material, so I'm not going to spend any time introducing them. We're going to spend some time among ourselves just talking, and then there'll be plenty of time after our conversation for questions from you guys. I'm going to start off with a question. 25 years ago, a jurist named Frank Easterbrook argued that in a famous article called "The Law of the Horse and the Cyber Law," he argued that laws of general applicability would satisfy any of the concerns about the emerging internet, and that there was no more need for a separate law of cyberspace than there would be for a separate law of the horse. Now, we've had 25 years of experience applying legal concepts and court decisions and so on to the internet. And so one of the questions that really we want to start off with is the basic one. Is there anything new here with the metaverse, or is this just more of the same? And in particular, I want to raise the question that was also discussed 25 years ago, whether cyberspace constituted a separate legal domain independent of local jurisdictions. David Post and David Johnson raised this in a series of law review articles. And I think we got to an answer. The Western governments might have been a little bit slow to recognize that they had full sovereignty over the internet, but China got it right away. And now I think the consensus is that the law of nations applies to the internet. And so the question is, doesn't the law of nations also apply to the metaverse? And just recently, the European Commission addressed that question. They were talking about their new laws, the Digital Services Act and the Digital Marketing Act. And they were asked the question by the European Parliament, do these new laws cover the metaverse? And the Commission's answer was, yes, they did. That the competition rules in the Digital Marketing Act and the content moderation rules in the Digital Services Act applied to the metaverse, and that consumers and businesses did not lose their consumer protection rights simply because services were organized in a different way and delivered differently. So I want to start our discussion with Tom, who's something of an expert in what this new technology might make possible, and ask him if he could address this question of what's new with the metaverse that we should rethink it in terms of law and jurisdiction. So Tom, I think you're somewhere behind me.
Yeah, sure. I hope everyone can hear me very well. So I join you from the virtual world of the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. So it's a pleasure to virtually see everybody and be here today at this distinguished event. And thanks for that kind introduction, Mark. So I'm kind of a technologist myself. I'm not a legal scholar, so I'll defer to the experts on the panel from the legal angle, but I hope to set the stage a little bit from the technology aspect. So my colleague Karen Silverman in San Francisco and I noted in an earlier report, Into the Metaverse, Technology, Legal Implications and Actions. that whether in society, business, or government, our time is already filled with screens of all kinds. Many people, myself included, are digitally immersed most waking hours. And while on the one hand, we can expect almost the full range of known human experience to occur in these digital settings, so too can we anticipate entirely new experiences and capabilities. I love that video of the Taiwanese missile testing scenario, for example. That is a great exemplar of what's the art of the possible. So we're going to be taking on new forms and new experiences, and this will eventually lead to unforeseen behavioral, societal, and legal implications, I would posit. So XR tech itself is evolving quite fast. I've attended the Las Vegas conference, the annual one in January, almost every year. And I've seen a lot of these capabilities and worn a number of the headsets over the years. Among the leaders in the field right now, we could state that Facebook's Oculus Quest 2 system is right up there. The other high-end systems, including HP Reverb, G2, Valve Index, Sony PlayStation VR, the HTC Vive Cosmos. And these systems offer not only digital immersion, but also haptic sensors you can physically wear on your hand, sensors that one would be able to detect and grab objects within the virtual environment. So that in itself is quite new from umpteen years ago, 25 years ago in the tech world. In VR itself, gaming is especially prominent, as are athletic, medical, military, and empathic training applications. We can physically walk around the virtual environment with omnidirectional treadmills. These are kind of clunky systems that I've seen in the past in which you mount your body in a sort of stage, and it's a circular treadmill and you walk around. In AR, augmented reality, the fusion of reality and digital enhancements also opens up new opportunities in enterprise software, health, fitness, productivity, and wearable sound. For example, if one is visiting a new city, one can use the digital information overlays and augmented reality to provide historical context, find that perfect restaurant faster, or like myself, avoid getting lost all the time. So we also may posit that it is mostly too soon to say how existing norms or laws map onto the AR or VR or XR, and where specifically we will need new laws. One of the challenges in this space is that the field is moving so fast. And so can policymakers and legal scholars and legal experts truly keep up is a question I have. As AR by definition engages humans in the natural world, so its consequences may prove to correlate with existing rules more closely is a question. In contrast, in VR, the experience is more fully immersive and self-contained, as we saw in that video just a few minutes ago. So its impacts and disputes may quickly take on entirely new dimensions. And to be sure, AR and VR and XR overall will share challenges, but they also will differ. Nevertheless, I would close my statement that we should assume that all behaviors, assets, and disputes that we encounter in the natural world will also take place in XR, as well as new dimension and capabilities that we cannot even fathom at this moment in time. So I'll stop there, and happy to engage in the expert panels with the true experts in the legal world and see what this all means to our society.
Thanks, Tom. That was a good overview. So Eugene, you want to jump in on this and give us a sense of whether you think there's something brand new in this that law and jurisdiction has to focus on?
Sure. I want to basically say two things about this. One is you might think of it as a proposition about prepositions. People like to say in VR. I say in VR. But maybe it's better not to think about this as in, but as using, right? Here I might be sitting in my office. Actually, right now, you might think it's not exactly virtual reality, but I'm using communication technology. You might say I'm in Zoom space. Nobody does, but you might. But really what I'm doing is I'm sitting in California talking to someone in DC using a particular kind of technology. And once one recognizes that, it seems quite clear that as a matter of jurisdiction, yes, of course, governments have jurisdiction over this communication, just as if I'm sitting in my office using a fax, let's say. The law of the horse point, I think, is a very good point, that as a general matter, if you're riding a horse, you're still subject to all the normal rules. And there may be a few changes, like, for example, animal cruelty law may apply to you if you are mistreating your horse in a way it wouldn't if you're mistreating your car. Nonetheless, we have to assume that the legal system does indeed apply, and applies pretty much the same way, at least as a formal matter. That's the first point. But the second point, which is in some tension, is a practical point, that we rely in different situations, not in different places, but in different situations, we rely differently on law versus self-help. So for certain kinds of things in ordinary space, we call on the police to try to solve the problem. For other things, we generally call on technology. Just to give an example, there are gardeners in my neighborhood who use I want to say gas-powered leaf blowers. Are very loud. At one point, I actually got my then gardener to not use it, but then other people still did. So, in principle, there is apparently an ordinance in Los Angeles which prohibits that, but nobody wants to enforce it because nobody wants to seem like a schmuck to his neighbors. So I put on a noise canceling headset, right? Under other circumstances, I might not be able to. Let's say if somebody was sitting was standing outside my store using a bullhorn, maybe then it would be too hard to cancel the noise, especially since I want to hear other things. So then I might call the police. But in any situation, we need to think about this trade-off. Like, do we use technological self-help, or do we use law? My conjecture, my co-author Mark Lemley's and my conjecture, is that with VR and AR, the trade-off will in many, not all, but in many situations, lean sharply in favor of technologically enabled self-help, partly because of what I call the Bangladesh problem. Bangladesh is a country that is a very populous country. I believe it's at this point about 150 to 200 million people. That's a lot of people. It's relatively poor, but getting richer. So presumably a lot of its people will be on VR, just like a lot of people from all over the world. And it's literally almost half a world away. You can't do fully half a world away because that'd be in the middle of the Indian Ocean, but literally almost half a world away. So imagine that somebody is shouting loudly outside my VR store in the metaverse. Imagine the metaverse presents things to people as a mall where it's like a store and people walk into the store and someone is shouting very loudly. I could call the police and say, someone's disturbing the peace. Oh, where? In VR. No, I probably would say, no, disturbing the peace using the metaverse. Okay, I'm not sure we're really well set up to do that, but can you tell us where he is? In the metaverse. No, the police say. Where is he actually, physically? Oh, I can do that. There's maybe a feature that allows me to look it up. Oh, he's in Bangladesh. I think the police would say, huh? Do you think that we can get him extradited from Bangladesh for the crime of disturbing the peace in a VR mall? No, you don't think so? Maybe it's not worth our time. Say, isn't there that mute button in the metaverse where you can mute any avatar you don't want to listen to? Why don't you use that instead? I might say, but he's disturbing the peace. He's violating the law. The police might say, maybe he is. Maybe he is an interesting question. We've read in our spare time, we were reading Frank Easterbrook about Law of the Horse. So we tend to agree with you. But it just doesn't seem worth our time, or really even worth your time messing with that when you've got technologically enabled self-help. Now, of course, it may not be perfect. You may be scaring away my customers as well. But that probably is something that the metaverse, or whoever it is that's running this little mall, will have more of an incentive to try to deal with by setting up a mute button that mutes visitors for everybody and not just for me. I'll give you one other example and then I'll close. If somebody in many places, not in all places, but in many places, if somebody's running around naked, that's indecent exposure. And in some situations, if somebody is having sex in public or say masturbating in public, clearly a crime. All right, imagine somebody has an avatar that is naked or even that depicts the person masturbating. That could be quite disquieting to many people. But again, if he is half a world away, pretty unlikely that we're going to get real enforcement and extradition and such for this crime, which, while a crime, even if one can conclude it's a crime, even when it happens through VR, it's not something that I think you're going to get the State Department involved in, let's just say. So if that's so, then makes more sense for the VR environment to have a button where anybody can turn an avatar blue, like a solid blue blob. So you see where this person is, but you don't actually see the features. So whatever's disquieting about him, maybe he's wearing a Nazi t-shirt, maybe he's wearing a Che Guevara t-shirt, and I think Che Guevara is a mass murderer who I don't want to see his face. Well, I just push this button. I don't need to call on the law. Maybe the law can't stop me as to certain things because of First Amendment constraints. Other things because, again, of this practical difficulty of enforcing jurisdiction over people. Technologically enabled self-help will, in many situations, take care of that. Now, not in all situations. For example, when it comes to financial fraud, it may be that there isn't technologically enabled self-help that can stop that, and the various other things as well. But I just want to signal that even though formally I totally agree that the law of individual jurisdictions would apply, as a practical matter, we will often find it much more useful to use technological self-help, which is much easier online than offline, than enforcement of various place-based laws, which will in many situations be much harder online than offline.
Thanks, Eugene. That was great to think about self-help as one of the fixes, or calling the police to enforce the law, which does apply. So, Rob, you want to jump in here and give us your 2 cents on this?
Absolutely, and I'm delighted to be here as well, coming to you from the east coast of Canada. I don't think I'm actually as far away as Eugene or Tom. I'm a bit geographically closer, but then we're all together in this space. And the question that's thrown out is exactly that. What are we going to do when we're all together in this space? And really, I want to bounce off of what Tom and Eugene have proposed, because so much of it all of it makes perfect sense to me. There's a couple of lines I'd like to push. Are we going to need new law? Sure, we're going to need new law. We're going to need new rules. Eugene used the example of animal cruelty rules, something new that as a problem develops, we need rules to deal with it. But the law of the horse question has embedded in it, I think, another one, which is, will we need new legal concepts in order to deal with the problems that are going to be coming at us? And this is going to betray my bias as a common law trained lawyer, but I would say no. From what I've seen thus far, we don't need new legal concepts. We'll need to take our concepts, we'll need to stretch them, we may need to distend them in some ways, but the legal system always bounces back, always figures things out, not without conflict and not without some unresolved questions. But if the question is, do we have a toolbox that we can use to go forward, the answer is yes. About 12 years ago, Teresa Scaza and I looked at the international law of jurisdiction. That body of rules that says, when is it appropriate, when is it permissible for countries to exercise jurisdiction over anything, over people, places, matters. And we applied that to the internet. We looked at what was coming. And our conclusion was basically what I said before. We've got the concepts that we need. And it really does start from that premise, Mark, that you raised earlier about the debate back in the 90s. Are we going to need another legal system? Will there be this wholly unique cyberspace place that is governed by cyberspace law? And it became apparent pretty quickly, of course, that the answer was no. And now this is a really positivist kind of standpoint, but the answer was no because countries decided the answer was no. Countries decided that they were going to act like the internet was in and on their territory. It makes me think of old jokes about your grandfather calling you up and saying, "Do you have the internet at your house?" Well, countries decided, we do have the internet at our house. We're going to regulate it the way we regulate everything, a mixture of territorial and extraterritorial jurisdiction, and a push and pull, between countries with which we are aligned in interest sometimes, and sometimes, of course, we're not. So the international law of jurisdiction, to me, is not going to change that much. What it's going to require, though, is a level of sophistication. Like when we talk about XR, we've got new technological concepts, and we'll need some shaping of our legal concepts in order to deal with it. And one concept that is an old one that just keeps becoming newer and newer is the idea that it's perfectly within the realm of the possible and the legal and the permissible for a country to say, okay, when I look at this situation, some of it is happening here on our territory. Some of it is not happening on our territory, but it's affecting us, and that's enough. There's a point at which that's enough. We can say, we're going to make a territorial claim to jurisdiction over that. We're going to regulate it. We're going to tax, we're going to punish, we're going to proscribe because it touches our territory. It affects our people. Now, it's one thing to regulate, of course, but as Eugene pointed out so eloquently, it's entirely another thing to enforce. And the kind of prospects of the Bangladesh problem are absolutely real, right? The practical realities around policing, well, we're already confronting them. And that's a point that makes perfect sense to me, that around the world we'll see resistance from law enforcement based on budgets, of course, and lack of training and all the things that often hold back international cooperation. So the scenario that Eugene presented around Bangladesh makes perfect sense to me. Here's the next step, I think, if I can be so presumptuous, Eugene, to add a next thing. There's a point at which, I mean, if it's a guy, with a naked avatar, that's one thing. Let's say there's fraud going on. People are being defrauded. There's a point at which the people will push back and say to their legislators, you know what? It's not acceptable to me that the cops just cry poor or say, I've got better things to do with my time, when my grandfather lost $80,000, when my mother was deprived of her life savings. We had a situation in Canada, in fact, where there was a significant amount of fraud being perpetrated upon Canadians from call centers in India, who would pretend to be our tax authorities, called the CRAs, the Canadian equivalent of the IRS, and they're just about as popular. But they would call people up and say, look, you've got a tax problem, you're going to be arrested, and they would defraud people of their money. People's calls to the anti-fraud authorities, which is essentially our national police, basically went unanswered for the exact reason Eugene threw out earlier, which is, it's in India. What are we going to do in India? It took our national broadcaster going to India and speaking to the police in India and saying, would you be interested in entering into partnerships with the police in Canada in order to combat this stuff? And the Indian police responded, are you kidding? We've been asking them for years to help us with this problem. And they wouldn't do anything. So our national police had to be shamed into doing that. In the global perspective, then, I think that the practical realities are going to be hit back at by the people who, in some circumstances, will say, this is not acceptable. You got to do something. And governments will be pushed to advance the already engaged dialogue and negotiation on how do we cooperate? What are the mechanisms of cooperating so that we can help each other enforce? So we can get the guy in Bangladesh, so we can get the fraudster in India, so we can send the evidence back and forth. And that's the kind of thing we're going to be talking about a bit later as well. Will there be friction? Sure, there's going to be friction. It's one thing to say we've got jurisdictional rules, but entirely another, where, to use another example, let's say we've got two naked avatars and, God forbid they're a same-sex couple and one kisses the other on a cheek. In some countries, depicting that would be illegal. And so that country might say, we're going to try to regulate that. We want to enforce that kind of behavior. Then we've got a double criminality problem. We've got other states saying, that's not known to us as a crime. That's something that's protected under our human rights law. And so those kinds of frictions, those kinds of conflicts will still emerge. And again, not to sound conservative, though, I don't think it's going to be that much different. Just amplification, just new details that we need to juggle and deal with. That's my take.
That's great. And thanks for this focus on the law enforcement coordination as a possible way to fix the Bangladesh problem. And so now, Bertrand, your turn.
Thank you. It's a little bit, first of all, it's a pleasure to be here. And it's a little bit difficult to redo the whole question of jurisdiction on the internet in 3 minutes.
Take 4. So
I'll try. The question is it more of the same, or is there something new here? There is a lot of the same. I've been working personally, I was in the field of virtual reality in the 90s, which makes me like a dinosaur in this environment. But I've been dabbling with the question of jurisdiction on the internet for technically 20 years and 10 years with the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network. A lot of the questions that we just addressed here are exactly the same nature, the same questions that we have been confronted with the internet, and God knows, and the World Wide Web, and God knows that we haven't solved them, including the question of international cooperation, question of application of national laws or not. Yes, of course, national laws apply, but there are a certain number of things that are slightly different. One, although the battle about Post and Johnson was, is there a completely new system of laws, or should the national laws apply? The answer as often is a little bit more nuanced than black and white. Because yes, the national laws apply on the internet in general, and it will apply to the metaverse as well. But there is something that is not quintessential with the traditional way of doing jurisdiction, the Westphalian way, which is the territorial definition of jurisdiction. And you have two dimensions. One is the increase of extraterritoriality. I don't get into the details, but it's one of the biggest new things. National authorities have to exercise some degree of external authority and extraterritoriality, which has to respect the principle of committee. And we don't know exactly when and how it should be done. And on the other hand, there are reasons to believe that the exercise of national sovereignty, even over the territory of a particular country, should be based under a new principle of restraint. Whenever the decisions that are taken at the national level do have an extraterritorial impact, voluntarily or involuntarily. This is a new conception. And when I say new, I don't mean for the metaverse, I mean for the internet. That's what is emerging at the moment, and we can elaborate in the breaks afterwards. Management of extraterritoriality is challenging the fundamental territorial basis of jurisdiction. That's one. Second thing is, even if we say there's more of the same, in any complex dynamic system, which our society and the internet and the metaverse are, in any complex dynamic system, quantitative changes lead to qualitative changes. You can have more of the same, but it changes its nature. Trolling and harassment online is completely different from trolling and harassment in the courtyard of a school, because it becomes permanent, because it's continuous, because it's scaled to proportions that were never existing before. So those quantitative differences lead to qualitative differences. And the metaverse will be a big difference because we will not be dealing only, and we are not dealing only with speech, which is already a massive problem. We're dealing with behavior and real-time behavior. The whole debate about content moderation has introduced some form of artificial intelligence screening of what is being posted with a minimum delay in the quasi-synchronous system. Here, if you want to have the real-time interaction, you cannot filter by trying to anticipate what is the behavior. Is the actor going to come close? So there are qualitative differences that are extremely important. So extraterritoriality, quantitative change, and qualitative changes. Another thing is the distribution of responsibilities between the states and the companies and the users. And everything I'm saying for the metaverse is taken from what we already seen on major platforms. Within the Internet and Jurisdiction Policy Network, we have a content group, and we're making and exploring a distinction between regulation of platforms, regulation by platforms, and regulation on platforms. Very simply, and it will be the same for the metaverse. You have the overall framework that can be set by certain governments or a group of governments to organize what are the principles and the elements that should be in the terms of service of the operators of platforms or metaverse spaces. You then have the terms of service of those operators that regulate what you can do on those spaces. And then underneath, you have within the terms of service, sort of Russian doll, the things that the managers of special groups or special subspaces will have in those metaverses. I mean, if you're in the Decentraland, if you're setting up a plot with a certain number of activities, you are managing a subpart of Decentraland. And the rules of Decentraland will say, this is what you're allowed to do and to set as criteria, or what you have to impose as a minimum. These are the rules of Decentraland as a whole, and there probably some regulations regarding the metaverse operators as a whole. So think of it as a layered system, just like we have a technical layered stack. There's going to be a legal layered stack, and the question of legal interoperability is going to be bad. The final point is to emphasize considerably, of course, the challenge of enforcement. And we have not solved the question of jurisdiction across borders. We haven't solved the question of cooperation. And we are confronted with something that is very easily described as a constant whack-a-mole situation, rather than trying to fight even child abuse imagery production, incitement to violence or fraud and all those things, where the laws are there. We can suspend the content, but actually prosecuting afterwards is a major problem. And that's even another issue regarding international cooperation in criminal investigations.
So Bertrand, thank you for the reminder of the Hegelian truism that quantity turns into quality, so we can expect something new here. And also for the very important reminder that it's not just speech that's going on in the metaverse, it's conduct, it's behavior. And so many of the issues will involve not someone's right to say something or to express himself or herself, but the right to conduct him or herself in a certain way. So I want to go back to Eugene and focus on his practical question, because I do think at the end of the day, these theoretical things have to give way to, so what do we do next? And to see if the proposal that Rob suggested makes some sense, which is, of course, the police in Bangladesh can't be bothered for trivial things, but for serious things, cross-border law enforcement might exactly be the kind of thing that we need. And add to that a second idea, which is often when you have far-flung users of a system, and this is what happened in social media, instead of trying to have the authorities go after the users who are usually too disparate and too inaccessible, you go after the provider, you go after the social media company. In this case, you go after the provider of metaverse services and say, it's your responsibility to keep your platform free of illegal conduct. And if you don't do it, then we'll take action against you here in this jurisdiction where you're located. So both of those look like ways to move enforcement from the theoretical and abstract to the very concrete. Cooperation among law enforcement and burdens on the metaverse providers. What do you think, Eugene?
Well, so as to the former, yes, absolutely. I think there ought to be more cross-border cooperation between law enforcement agencies as to really important crimes that cannot be solved with technological fixes. I expect there will be some. I expect there will always be full of a good deal of friction. And certainly for the perspective of the potential victims, they'd be looking for something that is easier to use as a means of prevention and as a means of dealing with the consequences of something than this kind of cross-border enforcement. But indeed, for certain kinds of things, it would need to be present, and I'm all for that. Now, as to imposing liability on the providers, I'm somewhat more skeptical, and I'm more skeptical about it because of what I call the reverse Spider-Man principle. So remember one of the famous lines from Spider-Man: with great power comes great responsibility. Good principle, good principle. There's also a flip side, which is with great responsibility comes great power. When we say that someone is responsible for something, we're necessarily empowering them to be the controller, to be the censor. And sometimes that makes sense. Sometimes we may say, look, you as a property owner are responsible to prevent crimes on your property. So let's say you're Disneyland or some such. So that means you're going to hire security guards, and going to mean you're going to put up surveillance cameras. Is going to mean you're going to kick some people out of the park and such. And that's fine. That's good. And maybe on balance, that's a good solution. And maybe we want to have kind of a similar thing with regard to the metaverse, where any particular platform provider is going to be responsible for preventing fraud and preventing various other things. Part of the problem, though, is once you give those entities that power, they start using it, and it's power over us. And power often not just over us when we're having a vacation, where the worst that'll happen is, we'll get kicked out of the park, but power over our how and where we live, in a sense, power over how we work, and the like. So let me just give a couple of examples. There was a case in California, California Supreme Court, I believe, called Castaneda v. Olsher, about 15 years ago. And what happened was that there was a gang-related murder in a mobile home park. And the mobile home park owner was sued by the victims, saying, you are responsible for not doing more to prevent this murder. Now, if this had been outsiders coming in, then you could say, well, you should have had a security guard out front. Although, that would be pretty expensive. A lot of people live in mobile home parks because they don't have a lot of money, and the rent is already pretty high. And if you have to have security guards or the like, then it'll be higher still. Plus, also, a lot of people don't want there to be a security guard at the monitoring everyone who comes in, all the guests that they have. That's a form of surveillance they may not like. But in any event, that wasn't an option, because here the attack was by somebody who I believe was deliberately invited by another tenant. So the plaintiff said, you as the mobile home park owner should have been aware that you have tenants who are associated with gangs and who might be bringing in other gang members, and gangs being violent entities, generally speaking, committing crimes. And the California Supreme Court, not unanimously, by a 5-2 vote, said, no, we don't want to put mobile home park landlords in a position where they're responsible for crimes by supposed gang members. Nobody knows for sure, of course, in this situation, whether they're a gang member or not, supposed gang members, because that'll put them in a position where they have to monitor what all of their tenants are doing. They're going to have to investigate every tenant and try to figure out, are you possibly a gang member? How are they going to figure it out? They might end up using rough proxies, such as, oh, you have some tattoo, which we think is connected to a gang, or you're of a particular ethnic group, and there happens to be a prominent gang of that ethnic group or an ethnic or racial group. Court said, we don't want to do that. Likewise, when there were attempts to sue telephone companies for libel, because of libelous statements used on the telephone lines, usually with outgoing answering machine messages. So the telephone company could have heard that statement and disconnected the phone line. The New York High Court said, no, we're not going to hold them liable, because they're common carriers, because they're by law stripped of the power to restrict that. And when there was an attempt, which for technical reasons wasn't covered by 47 U.S.C. Section 230, at least may not have been covered by it, was an attempt to hold email delivery companies liable for libelous email. The New York High Court said, even though they're not formally common carriers, we don't want to put them in a position where they have to be monitoring what it is and policing what it is that's said in email. That's not a role we want email providers for. Likewise, there are some court cases that said we don't want phone companies to be on the lookout for possible gambling dens, bookmaking agencies that use phone lines, because that makes them censors of private morals, and we don't want to do that. So I am tentatively skeptical of putting social media platforms, VR platforms, also social media platforms, in a position where they're responsible for crimes and torts on their platforms, because then they're going to exercise power over that. And they're going to end up setting whatever rules, saying, we don't like this group, we don't like that group. And for something that I expect to be as important for people's lives and livelihoods as virtual reality, I think we have enough trouble with the power of the government without also empowering huge, vast, and vastly wealthy private companies to further control what we're doing, even in the sake of preserving our safety, for the sake of preserving our safety.
So be careful of what you asked for.
Exactly.
If the platforms have power to stop crimes, they've got all sorts of perhaps unchecked power. I was hoping we weren't going to get into the Section 230 debate, but it does seem to come up no matter what you want to talk about. Can I shift slightly so we got a chance to cover all different topics? We've been talking about enforcing existing law and the difficulties there. But one of the questions, and one came in from the internet, that's important to think about is, do we need new laws? And I want to ask Bertrand to think about this a little bit. Do we need new laws? Is there something about this new system and the affordances that it makes possible that requires us not simply to enforce or try to enforce existing law, but to say, you know, we need a new one. We need to cover crimes that escape current law, but are real problems, and without a new law to cover them, they would cause havoc and harm. Bertrand, what do you think? Do we need new laws?
Well, two things. The first thing is, following what Eugene was saying, he is absolutely right, but this is not the direction that we're taking at the moment. The reality is that all the governments are saying to the platforms, it's your responsibility to basically do what we cannot do. The best example, if you think about it, is the European Court of Justice, the highest justice authority in the European Union, that gave not only a private company, but an American private company, i.e. Google, the responsibility to balance the right to access information and the protection of privacy in the right to be de-indexed. When you think about it, we have changed in terms of the world from a world where the entirety of the authority of regulation is in the hands of governments, although it's still theoretically the architecture that we are in, to a world where there is shared responsibility between governments, because we have to manage common spaces. And so multiple governments have to exercise jurisdictions over the activities that are cross-border. And they do not know how to do this yet. They're struggling with this, and I don't blame them for that. I mean, I've been 20 years in the French Foreign Affairs Ministries, known that firsthand. The problem is that the international architecture is not adapted to managing commons and joining jurisdictions. Second thing is that this repartition of responsibilities between the governments and the companies does not call, in my view, and that's purely personal, for new laws, but for new regimes, for new cooperation regimes between the operators, the companies, the civil society actors, the international organizations. And I want to make a comparison with this, maybe not as familiar in the US as the secession, the War of Secession, but the Civil War. But in Europe, the printing press produced the 30 Years' War that led to the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, which is the foundation of our Westphalian architecture. Very rapid summary. The reason why this war lasted 30 years, you know why? Is because during 30 years, each camp was convinced that they would win in the end. And they didn't. And in the end, they had to find a new solution that was a partitioning, that was introducing the notion of territorial sovereignties with the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. What we're witnessing at the moment, and it will be only emphasized with the metaverse discussion, and probably this is what will lead to a solution, is that there is a war, an arm wrestling tension between governments and major operators that has already been lasting for about 10 years, with a big pendulum swing from the tech euphoria of the 90s and the noughties to the tech doom that we have today, where everything that's going wrong is due to the internet. And we need to stop this nonsense. This legal arms race is really not leading to the solution, which is how do you catch the criminals? How do you cooperate to prevent fraud and abuses and so on? So at one point, there needs to be a way to bring the different actors around the table to say, how do we build new regimes where we co-elaborate, we co-implement, and we co-enforce, because the enforcement is technologically enabled. And these regimes need to be technologically aware, because otherwise there's no implementation. And the role of the different actors will vary in the elaboration of the regimes and in the implementation, depending on the topic, depending on the type of situation that we're confronted with. But I strongly believe, and I know that in the current era of non-cooperation, it is a really strange thing to continue to believe in this. But I do believe that we don't need another set of laws in every country that is not compatible and interoperable with the laws of another country that increases the potential for conflict of laws. We need to have not necessarily a global regime, but scalable pioneering regimes that will co-organize the relationship and the responsibilities between governments, companies, and society actors, because they all believe that they have a problem with each other. And the reality is that we have a problem in common and we need to bring people together.
So Rob, I'm going to ask you the last question, then we're going to open it up. So Bertrand's saying that, yeah, maybe we need new law, maybe we don't, but the key thing is harmonization. We've got to find an international framework.
Interoperability, not harmonization.
Interoperable systems that would allow the different regimes to function, regardless of whether we need a new law or whether it's just application of the old laws. What do you think? You know, some of the countries are going to kind of shut off their own version of the metaverse. Russia and China will probably have their own thing. And what is the role of international interoperability? One of the questions that came in from the internet is, do we need an international metaverse court that would regulate these different international jurisdictional disputes? So Rob, you want to take that? And then we're going to go into questions.
I mean, there's quite a few things there. I couldn't agree more with the way that Bertrand has presented things, and I commend Bertrand's writing to everybody who's attending here, because I've read a lot of it, and it is far-sighted and practical. So there are, I think, I love the idea of interoperability. The challenges, and you know, I'm sort of staying with the scope of history guy here, the challenges are going to remain the same. I always tell my students, we've got, from the perspective of criminal law in particular, which is, you know, really where I come down, we've got 196 different criminal law systems in the world, and each one of them thinks all of the others are bananas. And that's really an issue, because there are such clashes of values. You know, one of the dangers that has come up, of course, is, do we want the government regulating speech, you know, or do we want to be empowering tech platforms to be suppressing speech? Not every legal culture in the world is as protective of speech as others. So establishing common ground, as Bertrand said, has got to be the key. And common ground is something you build over a long period of time in whatever the setting happens to be. And we know that from the scope of history. What do we do about Russia and China and those who would close off the internet? Constructive engagement, I think, ends up being it. We create a system that is operable, that creates cooperation mechanisms among states, among regulating authorities, right? Maybe, you know, sub-state authorities, depending on the nature of the problem, and we make it work. And if it works, you know, we'll get all Kevin Costner about it. If we build it, they may come. They may eventually come in an optimistic sense. Because even in a closed system, in an authoritarian state like Russia, like China, like other places that are going for data sovereignty, the toxin will grow, and they will eventually be confronted with the permeability of those systems as they are attacked from without and within. So I'm an optimist, but I think in the Grossen scope, that's doable. In the meantime, we create a good regime among the like-minded based on values that we can agree on. So some sense of commonality around criminal law, and say that's the space in which we will cooperate. That's the playground. But what does the playground equipment look like? That's where great creativity is called for. And that's where I think we need to harness the energy and the knowledge of the private sector, of the XR providers in a way that hasn't been done thus far, for understandable reasons, because governments were seeking to regulate, companies were seeking to make money, and it's the public who end up as both the beneficiaries and the victims. So just as an example of what I'm talking about, one of the major impediments to international cooperation is evidence, is shifting it around. One country's courts being able to obtain evidence from another country in order to use it. When it comes to data, that's the most fast-growing problem. Still, after a decade after the UN flagged it, it's still the most fast-growing criminal law enforcement problem. So we need some creative thinking there. Maybe a global clearinghouse, maybe a treaty that creates a mechanism where everybody gets access to everybody's data without search warrants, without, as Eugene said, getting the Department of State involved. Something like the principle behind the Cloud Act, except really large and an agreed upon access system that allows the stuff to transmit more easily. There's nothing really lacking except political will. We know how extradition works. We can do it. It's just a matter of getting everybody on board. We know how MLAT works. We can do it. It's a matter of time and resources. Again, great optimism required to think that it could work. What's the alternative? The alternative is we reap the whirlwind. And as far as an international court goes, to respond to that question, our experience with international courts is that they are too expensive and too top heavy. I'm a bit of an international court skeptic in a way, although for particular applications it might work, like piracy, like corruption. But I think something like this is too broad for any kind of international court to function.
So Rob, thanks for the optimistic field of dreams idea that if we build a good interoperable international system, they will come. But it's time for audience questions. I've got one up here in the front and then several in the back. So have at it.
The anti-money laundering law scheme could be a template for this, because what made a general template that each...
Can you get a microphone?
I'll repeat the question.
The anti-money laundering law was made as a template that at each jurisdiction can take the template of the law, adapt to the jurisdiction of the place, Brazil, United States, whatever, and then they apply. You have a uniform system with some difference. For example, in some jurisdiction, the money laundering is a crime itself. In Brazil, for example, is a derivative crime, is accessory crime. You need to have a previous crime. So you can adapt for the reality of each jurisdiction. But you have the enforcement doing by everybody that follows the treaty in a way that is more uniform. So can be this template for this, not universal, but international local system.
Yeah, so the question is whether the anti-money laundering laws can be a model or a template for enforcement in this area. And I think Bertrand wanted
a very quick answer, as was mentioned. The whole question of international criminal cooperation is an enormous question that we have no time to delve into, but we are at the core of the problem. So all the different types of treaties that organize cooperation, and UNODC, Vienna, and other organizations are producing a lot of systems. So the Council of Europe in the Cybercrime Convention, etc. The more you dig and the more you try to get into it, the more you see the complexity of the paradigm of the territorial jurisdiction. And we are really confronted, to make a long story short, I'm personally convinced that just like the telescope of Galileo was showing the world in a different way, and it created the crisis that led to the paradigm shift of the Copernican model of astronomy, the internet, and now the metaverse and the web and all those applications that are fundamentally cross borders are just putting the spotlight on the limitation of the model of territorial sovereignty. And I believe that territorial sovereignty is fully appropriate when the actions are limited to the territory of the country. But when you get to things that are digital, a new way to exercise sovereignty needs to be developed, and we need new institutions. Because the current new transnational institutions, I don't know how they will be done, but the current architecture is a monopoly of representation of citizens at the global level. And I've been a diplomat, and it's the UN system. And this is not adapted for cooperation. And we need new transnational systems, and it's the big challenge for the next years to come. I don't have a magic bullet, and I've been working on this, as I said, for 20 and the last 10 years. But you're absolutely right. Looking at examples of new types of cooperation is the big goal ahead. And it's a fascinating topic.
So we've got one question here in the front, and then the woman in the back, please. Go ahead.
So thank you very much, Bertrand. You sort of answered my question. The one comment or the one word I haven't heard the esteemed panel speak is decentralization, because that's a key concept of this metaverse as the next version of the cloud, is that I don't have to have a centralized or federated body managing and mitigating the communication of data or information. Let's let the users, whether individuals or companies, self-manage their information and their flow of data. To your point, though, you're right, it's not going to happen overnight. But I'm curious, from a legal perspective, would that need to be the key that would incite, hey, we really do need to come up with a new legal means to address a decentralized commerce, finance, or my own personal private data?
Eugene, you want to take that?
Yeah.
Well, so decentralization, I think, is important in many ways. And technologically enabled self-help is one way of thinking about decentralization of enforcement, to say, look, better that it be done by the platform than by the government in this kind of situation, at least as to many things, but better still if it's done by each individual user, right? You know, some people don't like Confederate flag hats. Some people don't like Che Guevara t-shirts. Some people love them. So rather than having one law, either at the government level or at the platform level, why not have each user say, you know, this is what I view as hate speech. This is what I don't want to see in, by just kind of clicking on some avatar and bluing it out or some such. This having been said, there are two things that I think push against decentralization in some measure. One of them is, as we saw, there are going to be certain kinds of things that are going to be continued to be viewed as crimes and torts that there's technologically enabled self-help won't really help that much with. So fraud is a classic example. You know, you can't push a no fraud button because the computer can't generally tell, even with modern AI, what's fraud and what's not. Likewise, if somebody is, for example, distributing child porn, there are going to be attempts, and I think rightly, to try to have criminal law enforcement, and that's through governments, which are centralized in some ways. And in some respects, there may need to be more centralization because there needs to be more cooperation among governments. The one other thing that's pushing in against decentralization, at least we saw that in social media platforms, is network effects. That to the extent, so if you think about it, back before social media, what we had a whole bunch of websites, and people had the blog here and a blog there and an email distribution list and such. And, you know, each one of those may have had to decide about its content policy, but different ones have different solutions. On the other hand, because of network effects, because if you want to reach out to your friends who are all on Facebook, you want to be on Facebook. And if you switch to say MeWe, which is a competitor to Facebook, you won't really get access to all your friends. So it's kind of pointless. Because of those network effects, we've had a situation where social media platform regulatory power has been centralized in a few platforms. If there had been more interoperability, the way that there has been with regard to email, for example, then there would be less centralization, right? Even though Gmail obviously is pretty important, Outlook is as well. You can use lots and lots of email clients and talk to everybody in the world this way, in a way that unfortunately doesn't really happen with social media platforms. So I think there are some things that are pushing towards more decentralization, but if we see similar kinds of lack of interoperability with VR environments, we may very well have at some point an environment which is run by one company, could be in fact Facebook or Meta, and as a result, decision-making about what's allowed, what's not, or how much of a tax, in fact, you have to pay to the platform will be quite centralized. It's certainly quite possible.
Mark, could I comment on that a little bit, Mark, too? So hearing the experts in the panel as well as in the audience, what strikes me is that we're thinking a little bit too, shall we say, 20th century and what's going to be possible within the metaverse and what is coming up now. So there was a brilliant comment by one of the, in the Q&A there by Natalie, says, we're assuming the metaverse and metaverse citizens will follow the rules of physics in the real world. Crimes we never thought as being conceivable will emerge. I fully wholeheartedly endorse that because there's already the capability for invisibility, flying, different avatars that don't look at all like yourself. We don't have those things in the real world. So I would challenge the legal community to say, map the existing laws into those situations in which the laws of physics themselves are no longer followed and new crimes and new things may be popping up that we can't even conceive of at this moment in time. Secondly, we talk a lot about, well, this person is in Bangladesh and this person's in India and they're doing this activity in the metaverse. Well, perhaps the enforcement shouldn't be in India or Bangladesh, but actually within the metaverse itself. There's a mapping right now underway of real estate, of governments going in and standing up some embassy-like situations. Why not have the enforcement actually occur within the metaverse? So say an avatar does something evil to another avatar. Well, then that original avatar is punished. They're blocked out of the system in some enforceable situation. And the last point I wanted to make was, we have to keep in mind that there's not going to be a single metaverse. There isn't even now. China's Great Firewall is already enacted. They're standing up their own metaverse. Russia is, even in the last week alone, threatened to cut off the internet. Whether they can do that or not, create their own metaverse. There's multiple platforms. You've got Meta, you've got Apple, you've got many other platforms underway now. And so it's a proliferation of multi-worlds in a multi-metaverse world, shall we say. So what I might propose is we sit back and say, let's assume that there will have to be some set of new laws, some set of new regulations, given the context of which I just spoke. What would we have to do? And I think with the brilliant minds in this conference, we have the capabilities to reach out to senior policymakers and others and propose some new policies that they may not have thought about. I myself used to be a senior in the US government. I used to brief senators and congressmen and joint chiefs and POTUS routinely. Frequently, they have no idea about what's going on in technology. I will attest to that. Many are astute, many do have their staffers brief them appropriately, but for the most part, they're learning as fast as they can or just oblivious to it and really don't care. I think we have an opportunity right now to do something unique in this world in the United States, perhaps in Canada with Robert's connections and elsewhere in France with Bertrand's connections as well, to set the stage in this new set of worlds, which will subsume us in many ways, and especially the younger people, and is already doing. So I just thought I'd weigh in on the tech perspective there in myself, and hopefully that's some use.
That was great, Tom. Thanks for that appeal for new laws and new approaches to deal with the new realities. And there's one question in the back that I want to get to before we have to close down. Go ahead.
I'm going to take us back to the 21st century, sorry. But I wanted to follow up on the clearinghouse idea, because the first thing that comes to mind is abuse of Interpol red notices. And so I'm thinking data obtained by torture in some countries. And, you know, state Superior Court judge in Alabama isn't necessarily going to know that, and he's going to go to this clearinghouse, and this is going to affect everyday people. And I think that's not just this kind of thing, but it goes to what Tom was saying about broader new systems of justice within the metaverse, and who's going to regulate that? Is that going to be something regulated by the operators of the metaverse? And if it is, then don't they already have the responsibility that Eugene was talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Who wants to jump in on it? Anybody want to? Bertrand, you coughed, so you got it.
No, that's nothing to do. It's a very valid question. I mean, once again, the question of criminal cooperation is a massive challenge internationally because of the different standards. And as I often mention, there are very legitimate requests for access to data from extremely bad countries and very bad requests for access to data from very respectable countries. The Cloud Act has been mentioned. I mean, it would be a whole conference on the question of cross-border access to electronic evidence. It's absolutely true. For your information, though, I want to mention that yesterday, in the context of RightsCon, somebody who works with me, called Francis, was moderating a session that we organized on the question of precisely new types of data that are coming from activities like the metaverse in terms of behavioral biometric data that will be requested from public authorities across borders. And we have absolutely no conceptual framework for deciding what should be accessible or not, under which conditions. Give you a very concrete example. Just accessing the subscriber information, the name, the identification of somebody, when it was just a phone number, it was a phone number. You had no interest in the content. But if it is to verify that this person is a subscriber to a particular dating site that has a sexual orientation, that makes a big difference because it becomes an actual information about something that is extremely sensitive. So when we extend this discussion to behavioral activity, to eye tracking, emotional tracking, we are opening up a whole kind of worm. So strangely enough, there's this sort of competition between, on the one hand, the difficulty to enforce and the distribution of responsibility between the platform decision-making and the government regulation. And on the other hand, the complexification of the access to information in criminal investigations. Just to finish on this one, I think coming back again to the question of co-development of rules, I fully agree that there will be a multitude of metaverses, I call it a multiverse. Just like there is a multitude of websites. And on the question of centralization, decentralization doesn't mean that there will not be a power law distribution in terms of the kind of operators that emerge. I mean, the web is fully decentralized, but you still have major platforms. And it will be the same for the metaverse. Just like you can make, for the moment, the parallel between the Unity and Unreal engines as the equivalent of the iOS and the Android. There are many parallels that are linked to the network effect and so on, and the organization of what is actually, that's just to throw another word, humanity is organized as a hypergraph, and the metaverse is going to be organized as a hypergraph. And whoever wants to discuss the concept of hypergraph can come to the break.
You know where to go. So we got a dispensation for one more question, and there was some over here on the left. Anybody? Yeah, right here in the front.
Thank you. I work for a think tank in London, and one of the key questions we look at is how could we support the emergence of a more efficient technology governance? And one of the conclusions is very similar to what Bertrand expressed, which is not necessarily about new law, but new regime, or in other terms, new ways to govern digital technologies. And sort of the few challenges that we identify, obviously the international one that we discussed at length, but also two others that I want to maybe touch on very briefly, and I'd like the panel to give their views. The first one is the question of inclusivity. And And that basically, if we're discussing is the next iteration of the public square, at the moment is very technical and commercial discussion, and the governance model is very limited to technologists and sort of policy decision makers. The second one, and I think that's really one that we think is extremely important, is this notion of, or is the pacing challenge, or what we would say the lack of anticipatory measures when it comes to policy making. And a lot of those legislation are essentially reactionary, so trying to mitigate actual harms and sort of static in their nature. And sort of one of the things, and the key question we have is, what are the measures that would allow for a more agile and anticipatory processes? And some of the discussion that exists today is about ex-ante auditing, about regulatory sandboxes, but I don't know if the panelists have come across other technique and mechanism that would help for more sort of upstream type of governance.
Yeah, Liz Hyman mentioned that in her opening statements too, about the need for technology neutral rules to deal with the pacing problem. Anybody want to jump in on the response to that excellent question? Sure.
I'm not positive about this, but my tentative thinking is that if there are two kinds of processes out there, one of which provides inherently extremely limited inclusivity in the questionnaires terms, and the other which provides vast inclusivity. The first process is one of formal institutional decision-making, especially at the government level, but also in super large corporations like Facebook. You can mess around with attempts to represent various demographics based on sex, based on religion, race, ethnicity, whatever else. But the bottom line is it's going to be run by lawyers, it's going to be run by technologists, it's going to be run by government officials, who are always going to be a tiny, tiny segment of the population. The other market is, the other area is what is loosely called the market, but what basically arises when you've got a lot of competitors that are trying to serve various consumers. So if you look at it, the market for consumer goods, in many ways, is extremely inclusive, which is to say that if you and only a relatively small percentage of the population are really interested in some kind of product, that product will be, generally speaking, made available to you without the need for democratic decision-making about whether you should have it or not. The market for food, for restaurants, is extraordinarily inclusive. People who have all sorts of weird tastes, whether it comes from the way they were raised in a particular ethnic group or just because they like various kinds of food, can all be satisfied without the need to vote for that. There's a great restaurant in Los Angeles which serves Chinese Islamic cuisine. I love it just because I happen to like the taste. When I go there, I see people who, my sense is, have some ethnic connection to that or religious connection. There are people who are dressed, for example, as observant Muslims there, and nobody had to vote on that and decide whether it would be allowed. So likewise, I think to the extent that we can have these platforms be relatively competitive with each other, which would require some degree of interoperability, and focus on technologically enabled self-help, that's going to be much more inclusive. If I get to push a button and again blue out or mute any avatar I want, I don't need to have someone agree with me that that avatar is worth blocking out. If I don't like somebody displaying the hammer and sickle because I think that communism is as bad as Nazism, I don't need to get a lot of people to endorse my position if I can just push a button and say, I don't want to see that hammer and sickle on somebody's avatar staring in my face. On the other hand, if you go for an ostensibly more democratic decision-making process, which requires some entity to make these decisions or some vote to make these decisions, that's going to be a lot less inclusive. So what I would like to see is as much competition as possible between VR platforms, as much interoperability as possible, though I can see how that might be difficult in some respects, and as much technologically enabled self-help, where individual users are given more authority to decide what to see, what to do, and the like.
And we're going to have to stop there. Thank you all very, very much for a wonderful discussion. And please give me a round of applause for our excellent panel.